What is going on, Colts Nation? Welcome back to another episode of Bring the Juice. Your guys, Cody and Derek here. Back for another one, guys. I am back from my vacation in case you were curious where I was last week. Derek held down the fort. Do appreciate you doing that, Derek. But, guys, today we are going to be talking about Michael Pittman Jr. and his contract. Obviously, we know he signed a contract extension in the offseason for the Colts. We're going to talk about why the Indianapolis Colts actually got a really good value deal for Michael Pittman Jr. But before we do that, we just want to remind you guys that this episode is presented by Prize Picks. Be sure to go visit prizepicks.com today. Use their app. And when you sign up, use the code BTJ for a $100 deposit match. All right, Derek, let's get into it. So, obviously, Derek, we know the Indianapolis Colts with Michael Pittman Jr., who is their, no doubt, bona fide number one wide receiver. I mean, he's caught 100 balls the last couple seasons. He's been by far and away the Indianapolis Colts leading receiver, and really the model of consistency for the Colts with a lot of inconsistencies from other wide receivers and other kind of playmakers, if you will, outside of the running back position. So when it comes to this, though, Derek, with the Indianapolis Colts and Michael Pittman, they signed him, re-signed him this offseason to that contract. They're paying him $23 million per season. And I know there were people, Derek, that said, oh, man, I think the Colts maybe overpaid slightly for Michael Pittman Jr. when you look at it. Well, coming out recently, since that's happened, we've seen different players for the different teams in the NFL getting these contract extensions as well. I mean, we just saw Nico Collins, Derek, just recently, get a deal for $24.25 million in a contract extension. We've seen other different players, get some of these deals, and as it currently stands, Michael Pittman Jr. is the 11th highest paid wide receiver in the NFL. And so when you look at that, Derek, and you kind of factor in, the fact that obviously took their time with Michael Pittman Jr. They didn't want to rush into anything. In fact, they did that franchise tag first, and then they were able to kind of come together with a contract extension. And probably some other players, Derek, that are going to be on the horizon as well for contract extensions for the Indianapolis Colts. It does seem like the Colts were very wise when it came to what they did and kind of how they approached Michael Pittman Jr.'s contract extension. They didn't rush. They didn't, panic when it came to that. They didn't overpay Michael Pittman. And, I know a guy, Jason, over at, Over the Cap, he said the Colts got a major bargain. Honestly, he said the Colts saved themselves a lot of money in the way that they approached the Michael Pittman contract extension. What are your thoughts, man, when it comes to how the Colts kind of approached it and kind of where they currently sit with Michael Pittman Jr. in that $23 million per year contract, which isn't even a top 10 wide receiver contract in the NFL at this point?
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more background to it, so Michael Pittman, that 3-year contract worth $70 million, $46 million of that guaranteed. And I think his contract, was the first big wide receiver contract of the offseason, if I'm not mistaken. I don't fact check me on that, folks, but I think pretty close sure it was. So
it was one of that, if it wasn't the first,
it was one of them for sure. So I think he was the 7th highest one for a while there, but then you had Jalen Waddle get one, you had Nico Collins get one, you had Amon-Ra St. Brown get one, so it pushed him out of the top 10 by a little bit. Like you said, it's the 11th highest paid receiver. Yeah, so A.J. Brown got his new extension this year, making him the highest paid wide receiver in the NFL. So the five of the top 10 wide receivers that are being paid right now in the NFL got their extensions this offseason. So if that tells you anything about the necessity for some of these people with some of these numbers, it's insane. A.J. Brown, $32 million a year. Amon-Ra St. Brown, $30 million a year. Jalen Waddle, $28.2 million a year. Devontae Smith getting $25 million a year. And Nico Collins now getting $24.2 million a year. Now, I'm not going to sit here, Cody, and suggest that any of these wide receivers currently don't deserve this money. I could easily make an argument for every single one of these players and sit there and say that money is justified. I fully understand that. But I mean, again, the Dolphins and the Eagles now both have 2 wide receivers being paid in the top 10 in that category. So it's going to show you just how important the wide receiver market is for all of these guys, because what I think stands out the most for me is, you're right, the money for Michael Pittman was already pretty good, but now you're seeing all these contracts come out and it looks even better because not only is he getting paid less, but the guaranteed money, like if you saw Jalen Waddle's contract, Cody, Jalen Waddle is getting more guaranteed money than Michael Pittman's entire contract. So, I mean, not only do the Indianapolis Colts have not only did they get him for less money than what some of these number 2 wide receivers are, they also have a situation where they can be flexible now. You don't have to, you didn't invest $65 million of the $70 million that you put into the contract as a guarantee. Like, you can't play with any of the money at that point if you wanted to do that. So say Michael Pittman keeps getting these 1,200, 1,300 receiving yard seasons, they can afford to give him a few extra million in guarantee money going forward. They just have a little more flexibility to how they want to approach it, rather than a lot of these top 10 contracts where 80%, 90% of the contract is being fully guaranteed. There's no movement there. If you have an issue with any of these wide receivers from production standpoint, injury standpoint, or just don't want to play, then you have no leverage. You have no leverage. You have to pay these guys for what they're worth and what they're guaranteed. So it from a contract perspective, that definitely, it was a great thing by Ballard to be able to free up some help from the contract side of things. Ultimately, I think the big question here, Cody, is, does Michael Pittman deserve to have his name up there in the top 11 of wide receivers for contract points?
I mean, when you look at some of the stats, he's certainly right there. I mean, anywhere from, like you would say, 10 to 15. I think Michael Pittman's right in that conversation when it comes to his production, especially last year. His production when it came to the amount of balls he caught, the yardage, all of that stuff. And, and also you throw in the fact, Derek, that, how often has he had, you compare some of the other wide receivers that you talked about, he hasn't had even a player like Jared Goff, like Amon-Ra St. Brown has had. He hasn't had, like we talk about with some of these other wide receivers. He hasn't had some of these wide receivers have had, and yet he has still been productive, right? He has still been very productive when on the field. And like I said, like he has been your entire passing offense essentially over the last couple seasons. Now, obviously you hope that it can even itself out a little bit with some of these other guys, but really, Derek, ever since he got drafted, I mean, really, 2021 on, it's been Michael Pittman and really nobody else even close. Like, that's kind of how it's been when it comes to him. But, you talk about, that's interesting because you talk about, does he deserve to be paid 11th? Derek, I also wanted to look at some of these other wide receivers that haven't yet got paid, that probably will get more than Michael Pittman Jr. You already mentioned, obviously, guys like Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jalen Waddle, some of these other players that got paid. But what about guys like Jamar Chase? What about guys like Justin Jefferson? Like those are just a couple guys. Like I was just like looking at this list of all these different players who could potentially get paid. I know obviously the Brandon Ayuk situation, what's going to happen there, and obviously we know the whole drama with T. Higgins and all that stuff going on. There's so many other guys. I could keep going on. CeeDee Lamb, like so many of these other wide receivers that you could look back and he could be outside of the top 15 pretty soon, like when it comes to contracts, right? So that is kind of how crazy it is. While, yes, in the moment, 7th overall, you're like, oh, you think you're paying a little bit higher, but then you look at what the market is demanding and you're like, wow, you're going to get him, while you are paying him a good amount, like at the end of the day, when some of these other guys get extended here, maybe even coming up this offseason, like Michael Pittman Jr. is going, I think you're going to get a pretty good bargain, especially over the next couple of years. Obviously, we know that he was signed. It was a 3-year deal. So, I mean, you're really, I feel like, going to get a really quality player for honestly a good price. So I do really feel good about where the Indianapolis Colts are, where Michael Pittman is, and just kind of where that contract is overall. So feel pretty good about where the Colts did. I definitely feel like they did really good by Michael Pittman, but also good for themselves, like you mentioned, with the flexibility standpoint. So definitely love that for both of them.
As we said, guys, today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. Now, what is Prize Picks? Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. Instead of battling against thousands of other players across platforms, you're basically picking 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're choosing more or less on those stat projections to be able to watch those winnings roll in. It's very easy. Do you guys want to play along at some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and UFC fighter Sugar Sean O'Malley? Well, if you guys sign up today, you can find the community plays under the promos tab of the app to view the entries of some of the biggest names on the platform and be a part of that as well. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 just like that with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Like a lot of other things, guys, they also offer injury insurance, so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So if someone exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry stays live. So it's great bounce back for that one. What I love about the app as well, guys, is it's not just sports like NBA, NHL, football, and tennis, and baseball, and all these other things, but there's also a lot of others that go into it as well. If you like to place entries on video game situations like Call of Duty, CS2, Apex, if that's something that appeals to you, there's a wide variety of sports and video games and everything else that you can place entries on. And I love how expansive it is. Even just looking at the NBA, there's entries you can make with turnovers, with points. You can do combo deals, dunks, field goals attempted, all these different things. So there's just so many different ways to make money off of these entries. Be sure to download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, it's sponsored by Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. Yeah, I mean, you're right. With some of these other wide receivers and their contracts coming up, I mean, Justin Jefferson, as you said, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Brandon Ayuk. I mean, here within the next, because of the wide receiver market becoming so big, it's been one of those things where every offseason there's becoming this new trend. It's just like the quarterback situation right now, Cody, where you don't have to necessarily be the best at your position to make big bucks. You just kind of need to be good enough that that team can't afford to lose you, and other teams are going to be willing to pay you whatever it is you want. So, I mean, yeah, in a year, maybe 2 years, I mean, there's a good possibility that Michael Pittman's contract, he 100% will not be a top 15 paid wide receiver in the NFL within the next year or two with contract sake. So no question about that. And I want to touch on the point that you mentioned earlier about just the guys in the top 10, right? When it comes to, honestly, the probably the only wide receiver of this entire list that potentially has had a worse quarterback situation than maybe Michael Pittman has in the last year was Devontae Adams. But even then, Devontae Adams, for a good chunk of it, had Jimmy G. Jimmy G is definitely a better quarterback than what Wentz was, and oftentimes is even better than what Minshew was from time to time. So, of course, like you said, the quarterback play in and of itself is a huge benefactor to, the reason why the numbers maybe don't look as great. I thought it was funny, Cody, because I was looking at all of the different wide receivers who got paid this offseason. And one thing they all do a ton better than Michael Pittman is the yak. It's the yards after catch, or just the average result in yards per catch. Last season, Michael Pittman only averaging about 10.5 yards per catch, but a lot of these other guys, 12, 13, 14, some even at 16. So, I mean, there's definitely a discrepancy in the total number of yards per catch that these other guys are getting in comparison to Michael Pittman. Although I will say that it's kind of ironic when it comes to who has the most yards per catch, yet Michael Pittman was tied with Nico Collins for the longest reception of the entire season last year in comparison to all these other guys. So it is kind of funny to think about that. It's just the way the Colts use Michael Pittman. They don't use him the same way that some of these other guys do. Some of these other wide receivers, even these number 2 wide receivers and Smith and Waddle, like, these are speed guys. They're speed guys. They're not the guys that are going to get you 100+ receptions every year. I mean, they could, but they're not going to in that system. And some of these guys, and the Colts have not had a consistent deep threat like some of these other wide receivers have. Like, the way these teams run their systems, they're not afraid to throw the ball deep. They're not afraid to run those routes that allows Michael Pittman or their players to get open. The Indianapolis Colts couldn't do that the last couple years because who are the quarterbacks, right? Phillip Rivers couldn't throw the ball more than 45 yards if he tried to. If Carson Wentz had the opportunity to, we actually saw where Michael Pittman, that was one of his better seasons with his yards per catch with 12.5. And then 2022, that offense was abysmal. And then this last year, Gardner Minshew, they threw the ball to him so many times, but they were always throwing underneath stuff and never really giving him an opportunity to go deep. So, again, it's just how you use Michael Pittman. But Pittman is just as important to this Colts offense as any of the rest of these guys are to their offenses, regardless of the numbers. It all depends on the usage of the player. And no doubt, Michael Pittman serves just as much of a usage for his team as any of the rest of these guys do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you talked about it, just the lack of good quarterback play and the ability to throw the ball down the field, that the Colts haven't had that. You talk about this was like the first year that Michael Pittman has actually had, like, I feel like a competent, semi-competent offense, that's keeping him open and stuff like that. So, yeah, all those things definitely are factors into that. But, yeah, I definitely think that, Michael Pittman, he can't help, how he's used and stuff like that. He can only do as much as he can do. But he definitely showed, I think, a lot more after the catch, even if the stats won't always indicate that. He showed a little bit more last year, I felt like, than in years past. So definitely encouraged by that. But guys, let us know your thoughts. Curious what you guys think about the Michael Pittman Jr. contract. Do you think the Indianapolis Colts got a steal with that $23 million per year extension they signed Pittman to earlier this offseason? Let us know all those things in the comments down below. But guys, that'll do it for this one. Thank you so much for tuning in. And as always, guys, go Colts.